Now we are going to move on to topic 5, natural selection and evolution. Our first standard that we are looking at is having us evaluate evidence in order to determine a common ancestor for various organisms. First bullet point here is going over vocabulary that you need to know. This is not necessarily science vocabulary, but it is vocabulary that you'll want to make sure that you understand in order to better comprehend the text that you will be provided. The first word is descend. You might also see this word as descendant. Once you find that root, that's going to help you understand what the word is. Descend means to come from. Next word we have is ancestral. You might see this as ancestry or ancestor. It's an organism that came from earlier generations. Now moving on to the actual standard, we have 3 types of empirical evidence. Don't get hung up on the word empirical. Really all that we're doing is we're trying to look at the evidence that's provided either in model form or it might be in word form and trying to see if organisms are related. Our first one is DNA sequences. DNA is looking at our 4 bases, A, T, C, and G. We want to see how closely those DNA sequences match up. Now, one thing that we already talked about in the genetics section is you have to make sure that you know this flowchart. It's very possible that they're going to give you a DNA sequence, or they might give you an amino acid sequence, or they might tell you that the protein shape or structure is very similar. This flowchart will help you answer most likely 1 or 2 questions on the test. So we have DNA. Keeping in mind DNA is referring to our ATCs and Gs. Your ATCs and Gs get transcribed and then translated into amino acids. The order of amino acids is going to determine the protein structure. Sometimes they may call that protein shape. Those 2 words are going to be used interchangeably. And then we have protein function, which is the job of the protein. Now for DNA evidence, here they've provided you with 4 species, and then they've provided a little tiny DNA base sequence. Maybe that could also be a gene. And what you would want to do in an example like this is compare all of them. So what I note here on my first row is they are all A going down. Now when I look at the second one, I would note that species 1 has a change. Remember, a change in the DNA would be referred to as a mutation. As I keep going down the line, I see all C's. Over here, I notice that one has changed to a T. This one has also changed. And then I know that these 2 have differences. So those bases are different. If the bases are different, sometimes the amino acid sequence changes. When the amino acid sequence changes, that's going to change the protein shape. And then if the shape changes, the job of the protein changes. It is possible for DNA, you'll have something where you have to compare them like this, or you might also see gel electrophoresis. When we're looking at gel electrophoresis, we want to compare the bands. They'll probably give you a square, and within that square, they're going to give you lines. And what the test might have you do is see which sample has the most similarities. So if I really quickly go down the one I just made, I would see that if this is 1, 2, 3, and 4, I would note that sample 1 and sample 3, right, they've got 1 band matching, 2 bands matching, 3 bands matching, and then 4 bands matching. Keep in mind I drew this really quick, so if they're not 100% matching, that was my intent. So you're going to see how many bands are matching, and whoever has the most bands in common, that would mean that they're most closely related. Now keep in mind those bands represent tiny segments of DNA. That means that they have the same genetic code within those little sequences. The next piece of evidence that you might need to evaluate would be anatomical structures. This image here is representing anatomical structures. It just means body parts, right? Body parts. So here I have a bat, a cat, and a whale. You'll notice these are all extremities. One is a wing, one is a leg, and then one is a fin. This can be a little bit confusing because you might quickly look at them and be like, well, they're all different. But actually, if you look inside of their bone structure, all the bone structure is the same. So you would note, right, they all have one bone that makes up the top section of the limb. As we move down further, you would see in this section, there are two bones for all of them. Are they arranged slightly differently? Yes, but because all the bone structure is very, very similar, they are all closely related in terms of having a common ancestor. Again, if you want to move down a little bit further, you would see they all have phalanges on the end, even though you can't see that unless you pull back the skin. Now, one thing that my students have struggled with, right? All of these here, even though they look different, they're all mammals. Right? A bat is not a bird. A whale is not going to be a fish. These are all mammals. Mammals have common characteristics. They all have fur or hair. They all nurse their young. They all give birth to live young. Right? So all of these, even though they look different, are closely related. Bats and birds, not closely related. Whales, fish, shark, not closely related. A bat, a cat, and a whale are more closely related. The next bullet point says similarities in the order of appearance of structures in embryological development. This is talking about when an organism goes from a zygote to a fetus. If you were to look at the embryos, you would notice that, let's say, a human, a monkey, a cat, they'll have really similar embryo structures, meaning when the eyes develop, a little tail develops. Obviously, that gets reabsorbed for the human, right? But their embryological development is very similar. Over here, we have a evolutionary tree. You want to make sure you know how to analyze that and also how to make it. It says DNA sequences differ among species, but many species share identical portions of the DNA codes. The ongoing branching that produces multiple lines of descendant can be determined by comparing DNA sequences of different organisms. So how do we evaluate this? First thing is that on the left-hand side, you'll see that there's a time. This time is referring to the fact that down here, this is the past, and then up here, this is my present. The only ones alive today are the ones that match up with that present line. Notice on my right-hand side, I have C. C does not exist currently. Since C does not exist currently, that one is extinct. If we're trying to figure out ones that are closely related, let's say we have F, G, and H, F and G are going to be considered closely related. And the reason for that is because when I go back in time, they have this common ancestor right there. So these two are closely related because they have a recent common ancestor. And that recent common ancestor is A. If I was going to compare F and H, I would notice I have to go back 1, 2. I have to go back 2 linking points, right? 2 branching points. So therefore, they're not as closely related. Now on to the actual evolution piece. You'll see that there's a lot of overlap in these sections. So I might go through a few things that on the next page kind of quickly because they'll be covered on this page as well. It says, construct an explanation based on evidence that the process of evolution primarily results from 4 factors. So evidence means that they're going to give you something in the passage, but keep in mind, it's not just pulling that information from the passage. You're going to have to explain that evidence. So it'll be important that you have this background information. You'll also notice that there is a lot of new vocabulary that might not be science-based, but that you need to know. Number 1 says the potential for a species to increase in number. So if you have a good trait and you survive, you're more likely to survive and reproduce, and therefore your numbers will increase. Over here we have that word heritable. You might see heritable or inheritable. Those mean the same thing. Heritable and inheritable means the same thing. And again, a lot of times if you just change these words into things that you know, right? Like I memorize this vocab word, I'm just going to change it to pass on. It'll be a lot easier. The next thing we have is talking about genetic variation. I tell my kids when they see the word variation to change it to differences. So now I've changed the heritable genetic variations to pass on DNA differences. Sounds a little bit easier to understand. The heritable genetic variations of individuals in a species due to mutation and sexual reproduction, meiosis and fertilization. Again, mutation, let's define that just so that we can review. Mutation means a change in the DNA. And then sexual reproduction is referring to sperm and egg coming together, or sperm and egg being made, which is meiosis, and then sperm and egg coming together, which is fertilization. So we have sperm and egg. Then we have 3 bullet points under that. Variation must be present in the gametes, sperm and egg, to affect evolution. This has been on several of the tests so far. So in order to pass on any sort of heritable trait, it has to be in the sperm and egg if the organism is sexually reproducing. It has to be in the sperm and the egg. Read the answer choices for these very carefully because they will give you one that looks like it's right because it says gametes, but the rest of the blurb will not be correct. Gametes only refer to sperm and egg. So read the entire answer choice. I've seen people just go for the choice that says gametes, but when you read the end of it, it actually negates it. So make sure you're reading the whole choice. The only way you can pass on a trait to the next generation is if it's coded for in your gametes. Next one says variation in the genetic information of a population, variation in the expression of that genetic information that leads to differences in the performance of individuals. Next up, we have competition for limited resources. My students watched a video about finches on an island where there was drought. And when there was drought, they had to compete for the food that was available. And then that actually led to only some of them surviving. And the last one says the proliferation of those organisms that are better able to survive and reproduce in an environment. Again, proliferation is not necessarily a science word, but it is a word that you're going to have to know for this exam in case it pops up. Proliferation just means the increase in number. looking at this next page, a lot of these are going to be really similar to what we just saw on the last page. So keep that in mind. It says apply concepts of statistics and probability to support explanations that organisms with an advantageous heritable trait tend to increase in proportion to organisms lacking this trait. So let's break down a few things. First, advantageous. Whenever you see the word advantageous, we're thinking positive, right? Advantage, we're all familiar with that, but you stick the OSC, OUS at the end and maybe it gets a little bit confusing. Advantageous just means positive. Next up, we have heritable. Heritable, again, is referring to the fact that it can be passed on. So a positive trait that can be passed on tend to increase in proportion to organisms lacking. Lacking means not having this trait. Natural selection, the definition. Organisms with an advantageous heritable trait or adaptation tend to increase in comparison to organisms lacking this trait. Keep in mind now, another vocabulary word. Adaptation is just a positive trait. Now, it doesn't have to be that humans think it's positive. It's that for the environment that this organism is living in, it is a positive trait. These traits that positively affect survival are more likely to be passed on through reproduction and therefore become more common in the population. So if you have a positive trait, you are more likely to survive and pass that trait on. Fancy thing that they could write, instead of keeping it like that, is they might write down increase in frequency. An increase in frequency just means number. Over here I have an example. They will most likely give you an example that your teacher has not gone over. So it'll be up to you to look at the evidence and bring in that background information about natural selection. In this example, I have antibiotics. This is supposed to be a bacterial sample. You go to the doctor, you don't feel well. They diagnose you with strep. They grew those bacteria inside of a petri dish. Over here, this is what it looks like. These are all the same species. So this is all strep, regular strep. This one here, the gray one, this guy has a random mutation. How'd he get it? When his DNA was copying, a mistake was made. So this bacteria has a random mutation. Remember, mutation just means change in DNA. This is day one. You go to the doctor. You're not feeling well. They take a strep culture. This is what's hanging out inside of your throat. You go, you get your antibiotics. You take your antibiotics. Over here, what do you notice? I notice that there's less of the white ones, but there happens to be more of the gray ones. This mutation, which randomly occurred before you got the antibiotic, was a good thing for the gray one because they're able to survive and reproduce. When you survive and reproduce, you pass on whatever good trait you have. So many of the white ones were killed off here. Remember, these are all the same species of bacteria. You took your antibiotic. The white ones died off. The ones with the good mutation, the gray ones, survived. Now they reproduced. You go, you take the antibiotics again. What do we notice here? There are no more white-colored ones. They were all killed off. But the gray ones, they're still thriving. You continue to take your antibiotic. What you'll notice is around day 4 or 5, you're no longer feeling better. You're actually feeling worse. This population, which just had one that had the good mutation, right? Just one had a good mutation. That one survived, reproduced. Those ones survived, reproduced, reproduced. Now, the entire population has the good trait or the advantageous trait. Because ones with bad trait died. So a big concept is not that these ones that were white changed to dark. That did not happen. They're all dead. All the ones that were white were killed by the antibiotic. The ones that were gray, which I colored pink, they survived and they passed on that good trait to the next generation. All right, over here it says construct an explanation based on evidence. Again, they're going to give you the evidence, but you have to provide an explanation for how natural selection leads to adaptations of population. First thing we have is biotic and abiotic. As I've already mentioned in a couple of the other videos, you want to make sure that you know how to break apart words. So we've got biotic. Bio always means living. When I go and I stick an A in front of it, it changes it to no or not. So abiotic is non-living. Biotic and abiotic changes contribute to a change in gene frequency. We already said frequency up above means number. Over time, seasonal temperatures, long-term climate change, acidity, light, geographic barriers, or evolution of other organisms. So any of those factors could influence how well an organism survives and then reproduces. The end goal is that you need to reproduce in order to have your genetics, your genes, move on to the next generation. The next part says the differential survival and reproduction of organisms in a population leads to an increase in the number of individuals in future generations that have the advantageous heritable trait and to a decrease in the number of individuals that do not. That's what we saw up here. Gray one, advantageous good trait, survive. Make more that have good trait. White ones, dying off. Next round, you'll see more of the gray ones survived and reproduced, and by the end, only the gray ones with the good trait are left. Differential survival and reproduction. That sounds very, very fancy. All that it means, some are better adapted and more likely to survive. Some have better traits and are more likely to survive and reproduce. Next one says, evaluate the evidence supporting claims that changes in environmental conditions may result in 1, an increase in number of individuals of some species, 2, emergence of new species over time, or 3, the extinction of other species. Changes to the environment, either natural or human-induced, cause evolution. Species become extinct because they can no longer survive and reproduce in their altered environment. If members cannot adjust to change that is too fast or drastic, the opportunity for species evolution is lost. So if you don't have a good trait, no one in your population has a good trait, and there is some sort of environmental thing that changes, your whole species gets wiped out. That causes extinction. If some of you have a good trait, Those that have the best trait will survive. If they survive, then they can reproduce. If they reproduce, that trait will be passed on to the next generation. One thing that you are going to want to write down: organisms cannot get a trait because they need it, because they want it, right? Environment changes. You don't suddenly get what you want. Like, oh my gosh, I really need this new trait so I can survive. It does not work like that. So write that down. Organisms cannot get a trait because they need it. If it says something on a multiple choice that they got it because they needed it, they got it because they wanted it, absolutely not. How do you get a good trait? Random mutation. Random. That does not sound like you got it because you needed it. And keep in mind, a mutation is a change in the DNA. And usually that random mutation existed. Could be 1,000 years ago that random mutation popped up. Usually it's neutral. But as time goes on and the environment changes, that neutral, meaning not good, not bad, that neutral mutation might be beneficial. One example that we saw, and maybe some of you who I don't have also saw, was the rock pocket mouse on BioInteractive. It said that in a population that lived on a sandy surface, there were some mice that were sandy colored and then some mice were dark colored. Being dark in that environment was not good, but there still happened to be some dark mice. There was a volcano and lava flowed down. Now some of that sandy soil was actually dark colored. The dark colored mice already existed in the population. It's just that their numbers were really, really low. Once that lava came and then cooled, now the surface was dark colored. In this environment, being dark colored was the better trait. How did they get that dark color? That was because of a random mutation that happened a long time ago. It's just that now that random mutation was beneficial. The number of dark mice increased within the population because of that, because it was beneficial in that new environment. That trait always existed. Now it was just being selected for. Those with the dark fur were more likely to survive and reproduce, and therefore their offspring also had dark fur. Now this last one that I have listed here is really an earth science standard, but for whatever reason, they're putting earth science standards on the exam. So it says construct an argument based on evidence. Again, that evidence is going to be in the passage about the simultaneous coevolution of Earth systems and life on Earth. Simultaneous means at the same time. There's a few examples. I don't know what they're going to give you for this. So far, as of June 2026, they haven't tested on this standard. Ideas as to what they might. One, it says photosynthetic life and oxygen. Early organisms like cyanobacteria used photosynthesis. Photosynthesis, when I see that, I write down the formula. Keep in mind, I always like to split up the words, especially as we're learning them, so we can better remember what they are talking about. So we use light to produce, in this case, food. Write the formula. Anytime it mentions photosynthesis, write the formula. I've got light plus CO2 plus H2O gives me oxygen and glucose. So those bacteria underwent photosynthesis, and now they released oxygen, and they also produced sugar. It says they release oxygen into the atmosphere. Remember, the sphere atmosphere is the air. Once you had more oxygen, you had more weathering of rocks on Earth. Weathering, because a lot of us have not taken Earth science yet. Weathering just means wearing away. You might also be familiar with the term erosion, which was mentioned in one of the other sections that I went over earlier. So we have more weathering of rocks due to more oxygen. Higher oxygen levels eventually made it possible for animal life to evolve. The thing we're really interested in here is the effect of oxygen. Right? More oxygen meant more weathering of the rocks, and then also more oxygen led to animal life. So we have simultaneously, at the same time, these things are happening. Bacteria are undergoing photosynthesis. They're making oxygen. When they make oxygen, you get more wearing away or erosion of rocks. And then additionally, the higher levels of oxygen are going to allow animals to evolve. Small animals initially, and then eventually more. Next one, we have microbes and soil formation. If you go back to one of the other videos, we talked about forest fires or ecological succession and how everything gets wiped out. And when everything gets wiped out, the nutrients in the soil maybe aren't that much. But as you undergo ecological succession, more and more nutrients like nitrogen, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen go into the soil and act as a natural fertilizer for larger plants to be established. So microbes, if you know what microbes are, again, this is just more bacteria. Early microbes lived on land before plants did. These microbes broke down rock and helped form soil. Right? Not dirt. We're talking about soil. And here this could be nitrogen rich. When it's nitrogen rich, this makes plants happy because, again, nitrogen rich is really just meaning a fertilizer. It's going to allow bigger plants to grow. We have corals and reef building. As corals evolved, they built large reef structures. Reef changed how waves and currents shaped coastlines. Erosion and deposition. Erosion, again, that wearing away of the coastline. Deposition is talking about leaving behind the sediment. And then we have coral reefs are also created new habitats, allowing new species to evolve. Coral reefs are where many fish and other type of aquatic life live. It sets up a little bit of protection for them, and therefore new species evolved from that. Again, kind of that coevolution piece. And the last one, which really goes along with 1 and 2, plants increasing oxygen and cooling the climate. When land plants spread across Earth, they produced more oxygen through photosynthesis. They also removed carbon dioxide, which helped cool the Earth's, the planet's climate. Keep in mind, when you get too much carbon dioxide, you get that greenhouse effect, which traps in a lot of the heat. Plants, when they're undergoing photosynthesis, take in carbon dioxide, which help to cool the planet. Cooler temperatures and higher oxygen levels supported the rise of larger land organisms. So again, this is a new standard as compared to the old Regents. So far, they haven't tested on it. Most likely, you're going to be given some sort of evidence, and from that evidence, passage, model, data, you will have to bring that information together in order to say how two things are evolving at the same time. It could either be life on Earth, it could be an Earth system, or it could be a combination of the two things. Again, like always, if you have any questions, let me know, and I will go over I will try my best to answer any questions. Make sure that you know the Tier 2 vocabulary that's in the front of this packet in order to better understand the passages and the questions.